So, when we last left Virginia, it wasn't doing very well. We had cannibalism, starvation. But pretty soon, Virginia is going to come to flourish after a fashion, just not in the way that they thought. The key to their flourishing is going to be a Native American crop, tobacco. The variety that becomes popular is not from uh, Virginia. It's from the Orinoco Valley, and it's brought by John Rolfe in 1612. But it grows well in Virginia, and it's going to become the basis of prosperity for some, but not for all. It's also going to be the basis on which the system of slavery is introduced to America. And we're going to talk about slavery today. We're going to talk about how the particular form that evolves in the New World came to be. And we're going to try to delve deeply into the origins of this institution as it existed in Virginia. So, slavery is an ancient institution. The taking of captives for war and enslaving them goes far, far back in human history. But the kind of slavery that will come to exist in America, racial slavery, in which one particular race, defined by their heredity, is held to be liable to permanent lifetime slavery, is going to be something of an innovation on this system. And we want to talk about how that innovation took place. So first, let's discuss the development of the slave trade. So as Daniel K. Richter tells us, for centuries, Christians and Muslims enslaved each other in their wars in the Mediterranean basin. The same was true for Muslims and non-Muslims in North Africa. And there was, this is important, no clear association between slavery and race. That is what we think of as race, black, white, didn't play into slavery. If there was a factor that mattered, it was religion. Somebody of a different religion from you could acceptably be enslaved. So could pagans who were outside the law. It was on that basis that the Goanjis were treated as slave labor when the Spanish came to the Canary Islands. They would also import people from mainland Africa eventually. Slavery would be used throughout the new colonial possessions, the Caribbean islands, Central and South America. A fact that's often lost is the territory of the contemporary United States was almost kind of a backwater where slavery is concerned. It was not the main destination for slaves. The capital of slavery in the New World was Brazil. And if we look at the big picture of slavery in the New World, we could say that Africans sent to the New World actually outnumbered significantly Europeans coming to the New World between 1500 and 1800. Now, where did these slaves come from? Well, the source of slaves was African kingdoms with which Europe established trade relationships during the period of exploration, during the same period during which New World colonization was happening. Portugal began exploring Africa in the 15th century. That's how they ran into the Canaries, right? Was by sailing down the coast of Africa. And in the 16th century, the English and the Dutch also established contact with Africa and began trading. And one of the major trade items that would be purchased from Africa was slaves. Ultimately, a triangle trade would develop in which slaves were purchased from Africa, sold to the New World. In the New World, slaves would be used to produce various raw materials from indigo to sugar to tobacco, eventually to cotton, although the production of cotton by slavery really takes off after the period when the Atlantic slave trade has ended. And finally, European manufactured goods are going to go to Africa to be traded for slaves to keep this cycle going. As many as 12 million people fell victim to this trade, and with millions dying in the absolutely horrific conditions of the slave ships, which were packed and crowded in such a way as to maximize every bit of profit for the people engaged in this trade. One question that a lot of people uh, might be a little troubled by is, why did Africans willingly export slaves? Most slaves were not captured by Europeans. They were bought, and they were bought from Africans. Uh, Africa was not conquered by Europeans during the age of exploration. It was not overrun in the same way that the Americas would be. Full scale colonization of Africa didn't take place until significantly later. What Europeans were able to establish was forts and posts on the coasts of Africa. But there were powerful African kingdoms and states that would prevent them from going much further inland. So we now recognize the slave trade was very destructive to Africa. It caused a really massive loss of population. That's a big drain of human resources, a big drain of brains. It was not good for Africa. And it's one of the things that likely set Africa up to continually struggle throughout ensuing history. But we tend to think that there should have been some kind of understanding on the part of African rulers that this was bad for Africans, Africa as a whole. It's difficult for us to understand why Africans were willing to capture and sell other Africans to European traders. But one thing that we should understand is that Africans didn't necessarily think of themselves as Africans. Africa is a big continent with many nations and many kingdoms. And these kingdoms, just like kingdoms in Europe, were frequently at war with each other. And they didn't necessarily regard another kingdom's interests as their own interests. So slavery was common in Africa. It was a common source of wealth. It's generally argued that the forms of slavery that existed in Africa were not nearly as brutal as the forms of slavery that would develop in the New World, partly under the impetus of trying to squeeze every bit of profit out of this system that would develop in the New World. But nevertheless, slavery was common, and enslavement was a common outcome of wars. When African states engaged in wars, they would enslave their opponents. Again, they didn't see these opponents as fellow Africans. That's looking through a modern lens. They saw them as rivals, as enemies. Now, remember when we were talking a couple of videos ago about how one of the motives probably for European monarchs to take an interest in financing journeys to the New World was that they needed income, and they needed income in a time when they were trying to sustain these new and expensive armies. We call that the fiscal military state, where the state has to gain more income so that it can grow its army and grow its power and authority. So African kingdoms had this same problem. Again, we're always looking for those parallels, how the differences between Europe and Africa and the New World aren't quite as profound or absolute as we might think. And African states had a similar imperative. They had to maintain a fighting force in order to be strong, in order to assert their sovereignty. Selling slaves was one way to do that, was a source of income that, again, was perpetuated by warfare. You can see how it becomes kind of a cycle. And in addition to that, though, enslaving and selling the people of your rival is actually a way of weakening your rival. It's strategic. So this probably explains something of the dynamic behind the African role in slavery. This is not to take the moral burden off of Europeans who participated in the slave trade or to cast a moral burden on Africans. It's to explain how this was able to take place and maybe help us to avoid some of these modern distortions of history in which we think that there was something irrational or perverse about Africans selling other Africans into slavery. Africa was a place of nations and kingdoms seeking power, just like other parts of the world were. Now, why did Virginia end up adopting the system of slavery? And why did it end up adopting the particular form of slavery that it did, racist slavery? Well, Before slavery, Virginia relied on an institution of indentured labor in which a man could borrow money to come to England and then work off their debt over a period of years. Recall that one goal of colonization was to free England of some of its idle and potentially dangerous population. This was seen as an advantage also. Get these poor people, especially these unattached single men. There were women in Virginia who came over to Virginia, but men largely outnumbered them, which was significant. Get some of these dangerous people over here and get them to work in the New World, and then eventually they work enough, they'll get some kind of opportunity there. They won't be a problem for England. Now, once in Virginia, this population that was posing sort of dangers and threats, though, in England starts to pose some dangers and threats in Virginia because the terms of indenture are pretty harsh. They're extended, and wealthy colonists monopolize the available land and they charge high rent to freed indentured servants. So you end up in this situation where people are ending their term of indenture finally, and they're looking around for opportunity and they're not finding it. Okay. And that's why the terms of indenture are getting harsher and more extended, where, you commit this infraction, we extend it by this much. You do this, we extend it by this much. Partly because Virginian elites are starting to get nervous about this problem. That's very much like the problem England was trying to get rid of these frustrated men wandering around with no opportunity, often without wives, without partners, because of the strong gender imbalance and a lot of frustration. So they're like, let's just try to keep them as servants for as long as possible. In fact, Edmund S. Morgan argued that he thinks it might have been possible that Virginia could have ended up enslaving these people, enslaving white English people, because, again, slavery was not thought of necessarily in terms of race at this time. Now, one barrier to that would have been that they were sort of fellow Christians or fellow countrymen, but Morgan says that this wasn't necessarily an insurmountable barrier. Upper class English people really thought of lower class English people as very different from them, and could have ended up at a point where they thought that it was justified to enslave these people to get rid of this problem of having to free them from their terms of indenture and then having them pose a danger. Now, the danger they posed was dramatically illustrated in 1676 by an event called Bacon's Rebellion, in which you did have a man who was an upper class man, but something of an outsider, Nathaniel Bacon, who settles on the frontier region of Virginia. Now, the frontier region is where a lot of settlers who are desperate for some kind of opportunity are going to go in order to try to carve out some territory for themselves. But when they do that, they're in danger of conflict with surrounding Indian tribes. And so this frustration that they feel is eventually going to have its outburst on the pretext of an Indian attack. There's a lot of misunderstanding and misrepresentation at the base of this Indian attack and the supposed justice of the response. But it's going to turn into basically an army that says it will wage war on all Indians of all tribes, no matter whether or not they're friendly with Virginia. And so Bacon raises this army. He starts out by attacking Indians. He takes some runaway servants into his entourage, and he also takes away some runaway black slaves or servants into his entourage. And they start out by raiding Indians, but they end up by raiding the capital of Virginia and trying to drive out the government there and take it over. And they almost succeed. They sort of drive the Virginian elites into temporary exile. They're sort of hiding out on ships that are off the coast of Virginia. But then Nathaniel Bacon dies. He dies of what has been handed down to us as the bloody flux, probably dysentery. And that kind of breaks the rebels and ends the rebellion, and order is restored. But it really illustrates that, okay, there is a lot of class conflict in this society. There's a lot of danger that is posed by these indentured servants, especially when they get free. So, wouldn't it be good if we could sort of ramp up the importation of people who we don't ever have to set free? Now, Edmund Morgan said maybe they could have turned the English into slaves, but it was easier to buy people who already were slaves. And those were African slaves. African slavery had already appeared in the Caribbean islands, and it was going to be implemented in Virginia. He argues partly probably motivated by a desire to solve this social problem. Now, slavery, of course, is something that requires violent compulsion in order to get people to work. It requires at least some level of violence. They're never going to get free. They're never going to be remunerated for their labor. So there are very few positive incentives. So a harsh negative incentive system is going to be necessary to perpetuate the system of slavery, including various forms of violence, such as whipping. But originally, the attitudes of Virginia planters towards African slaves were not that different from their attitudes towards English servants. English servants also had pretty low motivations to work because of how thoroughly they were exploited, how little the prospects were for them, and in the early period of the adoption of slavery, there was an overlap between these. You had slaves and servants working side by side, forming friendships, forming romantic relationships, and kind of just treated as generally part of the sort of working class of Virginia. So, how do we get from that to a system where there's the idea that slavery is a condition that attaches to being of African ancestry, that attaches to being black, and a hard color line between white and black, and the idea that all black people belong as slaves in perpetuity, which is the ideology of racial slavery? You're going to look at a series of laws passed in Virginia that we see kind of gradually making this transformation, where you have a sort of mixed labor system in which there isn't this like obvious dramatic distinction between the African population and the poorer English population, and a pretty firm line. So we see, for instance, a law that is going to say that even if an African descended person is baptized as a Christian, that doesn't make them liable to be free. Okay. That's a big distinction. Now it's not religion, but it's something that's inherent to that person that can't change, even if they change their religion. You can see how that starts to look more like a modern idea of race. There's some physical inherited characteristic that person has that they can't change that makes them liable to be a slave. Even more significant is a law that says that anyone born to an enslaved woman will become a slave. Okay, so that means that now your condition is directly tied to your ancestry. There's something in your mother's womb that transmits to you the quality of being a slave. This is, again, we see the making of the idea of race and a link between your race and your ancestry and being a slave. Now, both of these things sort of arise in response to problems that the planters are facing. Maybe someone wants to convert an enslaved person to Christianity, but they don't want to lose their property in a human being. So the law addresses that. Although Edmund S. Morgan will argue after that law is passed, you actually see a pretty limited number of people making sincere efforts to convert their enslaved property. There's also a frequency of interracial sex and interracial rape. And it may be the case that people do, their question arises is what is going to happen to the mixed race child of an enslaved woman? That could cause various kinds of problems. One problem it could cause is that the slave owner sort of loses the opportunity to possess this person as property, but it also raises maybe a certain amount of discomfort. You know, people feel uncomfortable with the idea that this person who looks an awful lot like someone who is enslaved is free, and yet somebody else who looks that same way is a slave. And how do we then morally justify keeping this one person enslaved? And won't that free person resent the fact that their own mother is enslaved? And might that person not become a source of threat to the slave system? Whereas on the other hand, if you say that the child is going to be enslaved, also, some historians have argued that redounds as an advantage to slave owners who want to sexually exploit their slaves. And they get by that also the pecuniary advantage of a new enslaved person who is born under their possession. But there's also maybe a more general issue here. Some people have theorized that these laws are also meant to create a really clear distinction between the status of blacks and the status of whites. And part of the purpose of that is that it will make these formerly sort of dangerous population of white indentured servants and free white people, it'll make them less likely to want to, for instance, participate in some kind of uprising with black people, as happened to a degree in Bacon's Rebellion, where there were black people in that entourage. And it will also make it so that they are eager to, they feel rewarded by the fact that they're white. Some historians in later periods have called this a psychological wage. They sort of have someone of a lower status than them upon which they can look down, and they will identify with whiteness, and that will make them safer. That is a certain theory that's been put forward. None of these things are explicit, and we can't find examples of people clearly saying that this was a feat of social engineering. So I think some of the more elaborate statements of some kind of master plan on the part of Virginians to create these categories of blackness and whiteness to divide people, I'm not sure that that can be proven. But we can say nevertheless that that was sort of in effect. Okay, it was sort of in effect that white people of all classes began valuing themselves as white people and viewing people of African ancestry as black people whose ancestry inherently made them liable to be slaves. And as the labor problems of Virginia were sort of solved by the importation of slaves, you did see conditions improving a little bit for white Virginians. There was maybe less need to restrict them or exploit them as heavily. There was more assistance for newly freed indentured servants to set up on their own. There were reductions in taxes, and there was a general sort of rising in the esteem that they were showed. So we've now got to the point of the introduction of slavery, the formation of a kind of racial identity in Virginia, and we're going to turn in subsequent lectures to the consequences of this system for the country as a whole, which of course will ultimately result in an immense upheaval. But before we get to that, we have many other exciting topics to discuss. I'll see you in the next video.